G'day everyone, welcome to the Australian Reptile Park, bringing a bit of fun and animals to you. Now, last few days they've been with Komodo dragons and crocodiles and all the cool stuff. Now mine's not quite that cool, but it's something that's very important, and you know, overwhelmingly, so many people are fascinated by them. And that is a Tawny Frogmouth. Now tawnies are a still common backyard bird through Eastern Australia. They actually range right throughout Australia. But you know, let's have a bit of a chat about them. I've got something surprising that I'll show you at the end that I bet you won't see until I point it out. Now tawnies themselves are called nightjars. People look at them and it's always an instant reaction. It's an owl. It's not. They're closely related, but nightjars are very different. And if we just go through a few of the physical features that separate them. So if we look down here at the feet, now these are tiny little claws and they're just used for perching like it is on my hand now. An owl would have long talons, you know, a couple of centimeters long, and the owl uses its talons to grip onto its prey, whereas a tawny just uses its feet for perching. Now, one of the other main things that separates them is, have a look at the beak. Have a look at the beak. Now, the beak of a tawny, it might look strong and it can give you a bit of a pinch, a little bit of a pinch, but it is only made to swallow its food whole. So the tawny has to catch it with his beak and swallow it, whereas an owl would be able to catch something with its talons, whack, grab onto a rat or a mouse, and then it can use its beak, and an owl's beak would be far more hooked. And that hooked beak rips bits and pieces off the rat or mouse if it can't swallow it whole. So a tawny's main diet are things like frogs, invertebrates like crickets, different bugs, worms, anything that they can grab that fits in that mouth hole. Now, a few of the other physical features, and I'm going to save one of them till last, and that's its camouflage, because they're incredibly well camouflaged. But if you have a look, all around the head up here, we've got light feathers. And you see, if I just brush them, we get a reaction from the tawny. And that's because these are all incredibly sensitive. So they hunt at night. And the way that they come down on their food, they listen, and they've got incredible eyesight. Have a look at the size of those eyes. But once they get down near their food, all these hypersensitive little feathers here are able to govern and dictate where it is, and they can feel its movement. So I'll try and turn him front on. Can you see them all in the sun? Oh, over here, please. Now, look at those eyes. You compare the size of this bird to me and note that its eyes are as big as mine. Now that tells you something. They have incredible nighttime vision. They're nocturnal. So they sleep through the day, awake at night, and those big eyes are able to capture so much light. The bigger the eye, the more light it can let in, and the more light you let in, the better you can see in the dark. Now they have very reasonable hearing, and even though it doesn't look it, you know, I've got an ear that you can see, but this whole area, what are you doing, mate? You're going upside down. Look at that. Doesn't that give you an idea of how owls or frogmouths can rotate their head? Do you want to scratch? You want to scratch? So that movement that we just saw there in the neck is incredible because they're able to turn 180 degrees all directions. So whether it's keeping an ear out, keeping an eye out, or catching your prey, pretty handy. But this whole area around here that he's kindly showing us, all the feathers taper in. So the feathers catch sound like our ears would, and they channel it into the ear. Now, there's a bit of a special story about this little fella, and it's not something that's uncommon with Australian wildlife, but he actually has a bit of a tragic story that has a happy ending, which is him here now. Now, he was hit by a car on this left wing. And the damage was such that he wouldn't survive in the wild. Okay, the wing was broken. We've been able to pin it and fix it, but he wouldn't survive in the wild. And so he actually came in and has been in care here for a number of years now. And I'll show you, I've got some mealworms here. Now they're lovely. One for me. Watch this. So I've only got to trigger the feathers, and in we go. And they'll swallow it whole. Over and over. So they'd hunt for prey in the wild as small as this worm or as big as a frog. Here you go. Let's go a couple this time. There's my finger. So the beak like that hurts enough that you feel a bit of a pinch, but it would never draw blood. They're a really gentle bird. Come on, would you like some more? Okay, now what's just happened right now is something that I wanted to point out to you a little earlier. So look, something's captured his attention. Now this posture that we see is really typical of what they do through the daytime. So they sit in a tree branch. You could even have 2 or 3 tawnies in a small family group. And inside our aviary, that's exactly what he was doing. He was next to 2 tawnies. Now look at this camouflage. They look exactly like a tree. Brown, grey, black, white, all the different shades. And they are relying on that camouflage to avoid predators. Now, you think sitting there like that, it looks like a branch. But you know, behind me, in frame the whole time we've been talking, are 2 wild tawny frogmouths. Now come with me. I know the frame's a little wide, but you see this up here? That's a male. I can tell because of the length of the tail. And have a look just up here next to the aviary. 2 wild tawnies. Now, they naturally occur around here. They've come in to meet the residents here that can't fly, unlike these wild birds. And we've got a male and female. It's non-breeding season, but we've got the 2 birds sitting there now. So it's quite an interesting thing to try and spot a tawny. And if you can spot a tawny, I mean, we know that they're there. But if this was your house, you'll hear them at night if you don't see them. And you can look up the sound, but they've got a deep boom, which is woo, 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 and that'll normally give them away. If you see that, they're roosting somewhere, and the daytime's the easiest to find them. But you can't spot them in your peripheral vision. You really have to look and lock right under that tawny, like this one has. So he's just got the attention of the other 2. And just as we were starting, he was going through a bit of a vocalization, just letting these birds out here know who's boss. And we'll just duck back up to the shade. Tawnies are unsung heroes in that they are susceptible to a lot of threats, habitat destruction, urban sprawl, but there's one that really hurts them, and that's snail bait or rat and mouse poisons. So when we go out in the garden and we put snail bait out, and it hits a snail or a slug and the tawny eats it, the tawny's dead. If we poison rats and mice and the tawny eats it, the tawny's dead, and that's secondary poisoning. You can look with some of your poisons for rat and mice. What you want to make sure is that they don't have secondary effects, and that means if the rat or mouse eats the poison, it's the rat or mouse, the feral rat or mouse that died, and if something eats it then, it doesn't have any secondary effects. So you can look for that, and it's quite an important thing. But they're literally found right over Australia, and they're still hanging on. In the face of adversity, when so many species are in decline, tawnies are still doing reasonably well. Even in suburbs, I have a pair at my house that have chicks every year. So even in suburbs, in the middle of Sydney, you can still find tawnies, and that's a wonderful thing. And he's having a look at me here. I might put him away now. And before we do you want to hop over for some questions? Have people got questions there?
Yeah, for sure. People are asking, how can you tell the difference between males and females?
Yep. So it's difficult to tell the difference between male and female. If you're in a museum and you had a skeleton, you can measure them up. But essentially, if we look here at the length of the tail, okay, the male and female have different length tails. And so that's one of the easiest ways to tell. If I could show you the birds that are sitting up here in the tree, you'd see that one has a tail that's half the distance of the other. And so that's the easiest giveaway. Coloration's very similar, size is very different, very, very similar. The vocalizations can be different, but we can't hear them now. So it's generally pretty hard, but tail length. And if you want to know which is which, look it up, because I actually can't remember if the male is longer than the female or the other way around, but it's one way or the other. Another one?
How many chicks can they have?
Yeah, so tawny frogmouths, when they breed, they'll breed in eucalyptus trees that are around here, and these wild birds actually breed up in this grey gum here every year. And it's a really discreet nest where they just pick a few sticks, and they generally use the platform of a big fork in a tree, so they don't need to build a massive stick nest because they use the fork of the tree for that. And so the female will lay a few eggs. The biggest family I've seen is 5. Maybe you could have more in a really good year, but really typical is 1 to 3 chicks. The way that the chicks hatch is that if they have too many, by the time the last chick hatches, the first one will be big enough to eat it. And believe me, they do. So it's not uncommon, I guess, to have a clutch of 4 or 5, but to fledge 2 or 3 chicks, to get them to, it's a pretty big effort from mum and dad. They'll normally breed in springtime, certainly in the coastal areas. In spring, it means food's abundant, there's more food for the chicks, and they've got a better chance of survival. But 2 or 3 chicks is about average.
How big can they get?
This is a full-grown tawny frogmouth. I have seen bigger, And I don't know what governs the size differences. Certainly in the arid interior of Australia, they tend to be a little bit smaller, a little bit sleeker. But this is a really typical full-grown East Coast Australian tawny.
What do the chicks eat when they're young?
Yeah, good question. So the parents, I mentioned earlier, they will catch and eat anything that can fit in their mouth, but they have to be able to swallow it whole. Okay, so for the chicks, the parents' diet has to change, or certainly what they bring back to the nest, because, and this bird is capable of swallowing an adult green tree frog, but its chicks aren't. The chicks are tiny. They're this big, white, and all with fluffy down all over them. So at that point, the parents will switch to a largely insectivorous diet, start catching really small crickets, grubs, grasshoppers, moths, things like that. Look, they are predominantly insectivorous, so the bulk of the diet is insects, and when the chicks are around, the size of the food has to decrease. Again, an owl can catch something way bigger than its chick, and the owl can rip it apart using its talons and its beak. The tawny can't. It can only feed the chick what it catches whole, what it can swallow whole.
How long can they live for?
Yep, tawnies have a pretty decent lifespan, 10 to 15 years average. Some can go a little bit longer, but they're quite a long-lived bird. And even if in that you think 10 to 15 years doesn't sound like a lot, well, if you think that mum can breed by the time she's 1 year old and she can have 3 chicks every year, in a 10-year lifespan, that's 30 chicks. So, they're a little different to us in their capability of sharing their genetics and raising a lot of young. But 10 to 15 years is pretty standard.
All right, maybe one last question. How many tawnies do we have here at the park?
Yep. So how many tawnies do we have? I believe there's 5. It's a pretty stable number. They're all unfortunate tragedies that have been hit by cars or attacked by cats or things like that in suburbia. But about 5 is what we can comfortably keep for their welfare and their needs. So, hey. All right?
All right, thanks, Tim. We'll sign off for now. Thanks for watching,
you for
everyone.
We'll catch you later and see you next time. Hope you're well.